2 million people. In a country of 8 million. Gone in 4 years. Not from famine alone, though there was famine. Not from disease alone, though there was disease. Not from war alone, though there was war. From a decision. A deliberate, ideologically motivated, bureaucratically organized decision made by a small group of men who called themselves the Khmer Rouge, and who, between 1975 and 1979, attempted to remake Cambodia from the ground up by removing everyone they considered an obstacle to the society they were building. The people they removed did not survive the removal. Pol Pot, the man who led them, died in 1998 under house arrest. He was never convicted of genocide. He was never tried. This is the story of what happened in Cambodia, and of the silence that the world chose, for reasons that still require explanation, to maintain while it was happening. The Khmer Rouge did not come to power in a vacuum. Cambodia in the early 1970s was a country being destroyed by forces largely outside its control. The Vietnam War had spilled across the border. American bombing campaigns targeting North Vietnamese supply routes through Cambodian territory had killed an estimated 150,000 Cambodian civilians and destabilized the country's political foundations. A US-backed coup in 1970 had replaced the neutralist Prince Sihanouk with a pro-American government that lacked popular legitimacy and proved incapable of maintaining order. Into that chaos, the Khmer Rouge, a communist guerrilla movement that had been building strength in the countryside for years, advanced. They took Phnom Penh on April 17, 1975. The city's population greeted them with cautious relief. The civil war was over. The bombing had stopped. Perhaps now things would stabilize. Within days, the Khmer Rouge began evacuating the entire population of Phnom Penh into the countryside. 2 million people, forced from their homes at gunpoint, told they were being moved temporarily for their own safety. Hospitals were emptied. Patients carried out on their beds on their 4 drips into the streets. The sick, the elderly, anyone who could not walk was left to manage as they could. This was not a logistical decision. It was the first act of Year Zero. The concept of Year Zero was the ideological foundation of everything the Khmer Rouge did. The idea was simple and total. Cambodian society was corrupt beyond reform. The cities were contaminated by capitalism, by foreign influence, by the accumulated moral failures of the old order. The only solution was to erase what existed and begin again, to reset the calendar to zero and build a pure agrarian communist society from nothing. Everything that existed before Year Zero was contaminated. Everyone who had benefited from the old society was contaminated. The contaminated had to be removed. The Khmer Rouge divided the population into categories that determined survival. The base people, rural peasants who had lived under Khmer Rouge control before the takeover, were considered the purest class. They were the foundation of the new society. The new people, the urban population that had lived under the old government, were considered contaminated by definition. They had lived in cities. They had worked for the old order. They had been exposed to foreign ideas. Their contamination was presumed regardless of their individual beliefs or actions. Beyond the new people were specific categories of people who were to be eliminated entirely. Intellectuals, identified by education, by profession, or simply by wearing glasses, which the Khmer Rouge associated with literacy and therefore with the old order. Former soldiers and officials of the previous government. Buddhist monks. Ethnic Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cham Muslim minorities. Anyone who showed signs of resistance. The categories were not applied with precision. They were applied with terror. A child who mentioned that their father had been a teacher. A woman whose hands were too soft to have been a farmer's. A man who spoke French. These were the kinds of evidence on which life and death decisions were made, quickly, by local cadres with absolute authority and no accountability. The killing was not random. It was organized. The Khmer Rouge built an apparatus of detention, interrogation, and execution that operated across the country with the efficiency that ideological certainty produces when it is combined with absolute power and the complete absence of external accountability. The centerpiece of this apparatus in Phnom Penh was S21, the security prison 21, housed in a former school in the city. Between 1975 and 1979, an estimated 17,000 people were brought to S21. They were accused of being traitors to the revolution, to the Khmer Rouge, to Pol Pot personally. They were interrogated under torture. They were forced to confess to crimes they had not committed and to name accomplices who would then be brought in and subjected to the same process. Of the estimated 17,000 people processed through S-21, approximately 12 survived. The confessions extracted at S-21 were meticulous and absurd in equal measure. Detailed documents in which prisoners described elaborate networks of CIA agents and Vietnamese spies that existed entirely in the imagination of their interrogators. The Khmer Rouge kept these records with bureaucratic precision. The records survived. They are now among the primary documentary evidence of what occurred. Beyond S-21, the killing fields themselves, the sites outside cities and towns where prisoners were taken to be executed and buried in mass graves, operated across the country. Ammunition was expensive. Executions were carried out with agricultural tools, with bamboo clubs, with bare hands. Children were killed to prevent future revenge. The logic was total. If you eliminate the enemy, you must also eliminate those who might one day seek revenge for the enemy's death. The children of enemies were enemies. The Khmer Rouge fed its own people into the same machinery. Internal purges consumed cadres who were accused of disloyalty, accusations that multiplied as paranoia intensified and the regime began to eat itself. Regional commanders were purged. Military officers were purged. Anyone whose loyalty was questioned became a potential victim of the same system they had operated. By 1979, the Khmer Rouge had killed an estimated 1.7 to 2.5 million people, between 25 and 33% of Cambodia's entire population. The international community's response to the Khmer Rouge genocide is one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the history of international human rights. The United States, still processing the humiliation of Vietnam, was disinclined to intervene in another Southeast Asian conflict. China was providing diplomatic and material support to the Khmer Rouge as a counterbalance to Soviet-aligned Vietnam. The Soviet Union was focused elsewhere. The United Nations continued to recognize the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government, including after they had been driven from power, because the geopolitical interests of the major powers made recognition convenient. The genocide was not a secret. Refugees who escaped Cambodia carried testimony of what was happening. Journalists reported what they could access. The evidence was available. The world chose for 4 years to look at other things. The Khmer Rouge regime ended not because the international community intervened. It ended because Vietnam invaded. In December 1978, Vietnamese forces crossed the Cambodian border in response to Khmer Rouge attacks on Vietnamese territory. They took Phnom Penh on January 7, 1979. The Khmer Rouge fled to the jungle and the Thai border regions, where they would continue to operate as a guerrilla force for nearly 2 more decades. The Vietnamese invasion saved the lives of the Cambodians who remained. It also created a new geopolitical problem. Vietnam was Soviet-aligned. The United States, China, and their allies opposed Soviet influence in Southeast Asia. Supporting the Vietnamese-installed government in Phnom Penh meant accepting Soviet influence. The alternative, however grotesque, was to maintain recognition of the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government. That is what happened. The United Nations continued to recognize the Khmer Rouge as occupying Cambodia's seat in the General Assembly until 1982. International aid that might have helped rebuild Cambodia was withheld or redirected. The Khmer Rouge, sheltering along the Thai border with Chinese and American support, remained a political and military force. The men who had overseen the genocide continued to live. Pol Pot died on April 15, 1998, under house arrest by his own former colleagues who had finally turned on him. He was 69 years old. He had never been arrested by an international authority. He had never appeared before any court. He had given a single interview to a journalist 2 weeks before his death in which he said, of the deaths of 2 million people, that his conscience was clear. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the tribunal established to prosecute Khmer Rouge leaders, was not created until 2003, 24 years after the regime fell. By that time, most of the senior leaders were elderly, ill, or dead. Nguyen Chia, the Khmer Rouge's chief ideologist, known as Brother Number 2, was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity in 2018. He was 92 years old. He died in prison in 2019. Khieu Samphan, the Khmer Rouge's head of state, was convicted in 2018. He was 87. 2 convictions. For the deaths of 2 million people. 40 years after it happened. The killing fields of Cambodia are still there. Some have been excavated and documented. Some have been turned into memorials. Some are still farmland, still planted, still harvested by Cambodians who know what the soil beneath their feet contains and who plant anyway because the land is what they have and life continues. Cambodia in 2024 is a country of approximately 17 million people. Approximately 1 in 3 Cambodians alive today lost a family member to the Khmer Rouge. The psychological and social consequences of losing between a quarter and a third of a national population in 4 years have been studied extensively by researchers in trauma, public health, and sociology. The findings are consistent across disciplines. The damage is multigenerational. The children of survivors carry patterns of grief, anxiety, and disrupted attachment that the trauma literature has documented in detail. Their children carry echoes of those patterns. A genocide does not end when the killing stops. It continues through the people who survived and the people those survivors raised and the people those people are raising now. The Tul Sling Genocide Museum in Phnom Penh, the former S21, receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. Cambodian school children visit as part of their education. The photographs of the 17,000 people who passed through S21 line the walls. The rooms where the interrogations occurred are preserved as they were. The last survivors of the Khmer Rouge genocide are in their 60s and 70s. Their children are raising their grandchildren in a country that is still, in ways that are not always visible, living with what was done to it between 1975 and 1979. Pol Pot died in his bed. 2 men were convicted. 2 million people were killed. The fields are still there.